Okay.
Just 1 second. There it is. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. We were already talking about the the benefits of having it online, but also, of course, the drawbacks of not being able to meet in person. But nevertheless, it's really like a pleasure to be here virtually and to talk to you guys. So, welcome to the talk. I want to basically to report a little bit and to describe my point of view in the research that we have been doing on multimodal communication in human-agent interaction, and why I think this it's crucial to have these interactive agents becoming more socially aware. All right, so I don't need to tell you, I guess, that human-agent interaction and collaboration is a very, 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 very important field nowadays, and we have a lot of like upcoming trends and technology that we can use there. And we see physical robots, like for instance, like service robots and assistive robots in households. We have what's called cobots, collaborative robots now in working environments. We also have a lot of like voice-based and conversational agents, like our cognitive voice-based assistants. And of course, we have embodied robots and virtual characters, and they all are supposed to interact with humans in a specific situation, right, for a specific purpose. And one key challenge, obviously, is to enable those systems to be able to understand actually what is important in a given social situation to the user, to the task in this situation, right? And then not only to be able to understand it, but also then to respond to this in a robust, timely, and also adaptive and cooperative manner, right? Now, this is, of course, like a very huge challenge, and this is a challenge that people have been working on for almost like 5 decades now, when we talk about human agent, human robot, human machine interaction, and so on and so forth. So, but nevertheless, now since we have been like progressing in our work, and also our technology has been progressing in terms of, for instance, how we can gather data about users and how we can process data using machine learning and so on and so forth, it has really become like one of the core topics now to ask the question, okay, what actually is it that the agents need to be able to pick up on, and how can we enable to do so? And I think a lot of people now have been starting to talk about this topic more or less using the term awareness, basically. So we have a long tradition of what's called context-aware systems, so to be able to deliver the right information at the right time to the right person in the right way in the right place. In robotics, especially mobile robots, people have been talking a lot about like socially aware and human aware robots, mainly originally in the field of navigation. So how to be aware of when the mobile robot is supposed to navigate an environment, how to be aware of where a human is, and how to make it like socially acceptable, for instance. But also later on, human awareness has been very important in the realm of motion planning and more general action planning, for instance, also of robots, when it comes to systems that are supposed to be able to produce behavior that is not only functional with respect to reaching a goal, but also that is also, for instance, understandable and transparent to a human user there. And this has been like really famously like framed by Kopp Party in his 2018 AAAI presidential address, and then later on the paper is called "The Challenges of Human Aware AI Systems." A similar term is social awareness. I already talked about the socially aware navigation topic that we have in mobile robots, but we also have it in socially interactive agents like multimodal systems, embodied robots, conversational robots, virtual characters, and so on and so forth. So the idea to make those socially aware, like for instance here by Alex Pentland in his 2005 paper, by saying, okay, building machines that understand social signals in social context, and this is what he frames as social awareness, has been like an overarching theme overall. And it's becoming more and more actually prominent nowadays. We have a lot of centers of human aware or human-centered AI and those things, for instance. So if I want to talk about what I feel like is really important to make interactive agents socially aware, and I mean like sufficiently socially aware and able to have like a working, robust, acceptable, efficient interaction with a human user in a specific situation and in a specific context for a specific purpose, right? And so by and large, people have been distinguishing between, on the one hand side, okay, awareness, as for instance, Alex Pentland did it in his famous paper 20 years ago almost, that is really make the system able to capture and to recognize and to detect and to interpret all the relevant social signals in order to derive and to make it aware of, the state of the situation basically, and the user and the context, right? So we have a lot of systems nowadays and a lot of work that's being done in these fields, like started out with like social signal processing and affective computing and multimodal behavior processing. And the idea is really to have models that can pick up on all kinds of different data about users and then to derive underlying mental states, for instance, affective states, cognitive state, and so on and so forth. Right. So one example here, for instance, is we want systems to be able to recognize user states that are really, of course, first and foremost relevant to the interaction, so that the system can actually really make use of it in a good way. So interaction-related user states, like for instance, confusion, agreement, disagreement, skepticism, uncertainty, attitudinal reactions, and something like this, right? Of course, you know that we can nowadays do it because we have a lot of data, video data, and so on and so forth, but unlabeled data, because these states are often not like very well labeled, and if they're labeled, the quality of the data in terms of the quality of the labeling, the agreement, and so on and so forth is often not very high. But if we had such a data, and we do have a good amount of those data, still we can, like as usual nowadays, we can do a deep learning, for instance, and then here, this is an architecture that we built in order to be able to estimate agreement, disagreement on the one hand, and on the other hand, like confusion. And not from, let's say, semantics of communicative behavior, but from really only like surface visual and acoustic cues. So the intonation and speech prosody of the user, as well as mainly the facial landmarks. So since we don't have a lot of good label data, but we also have a lot of unlabeled data, like for instance YouTube videos. Now here's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it is already being done in terms of semi-supervised, self-supervised learning, and how to combine those, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is just one example, and we can have now systems that can in real time, for instance, detect things like agreement here, disagreement, or confusion.
No questions to find out which card I had picked. It's not 12 cards.
So user's very confused. It goes up here.
Okay.
And then the user is agreeing, and then that's being recognized, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a lot of interesting things that we can ask ourselves here. For instance, what are the most informative cues, for instance, right? And we see here that multimodal cues, and this is something that we know, also called, for instance, super additivity in multimodal signal processing or behavior processing, is multimodal cues together work better than only like unimodal cues. So audio only or face only, it's quite okay, but it really gets better, a lot better when we have combined multimodal input and so on and so forth. All right, so this is the input processing side. What I want to focus on for the rest of the talk, and what I also have been working on, like basically throughout all my career, my scientific career, is really the question: okay, how can we build systems that are able to express themselves? So how could they, given that they have communicative modalities, like for instance speech, facial expressions, head movements, and hands, how can they really be able to produce behavior that is understandable to the user in a specific situation, such that an ongoing unfolding interaction actually now takes place that is, in the end successful. So how can we build predictive and generative models of communicative social interactive behaviors? And how can we employ those models for instance, questions of dialogue interaction management? So how could the system decide and select what kind of behavior to perform next in order to achieve certain task goals, but also social goals, for instance? And if it decided to do so, then how can we actually now generate that behavior, and how can then finally we actually now play it out, for instance, through robot body with all the given constraints and limitations that it might have, or with a virtual character, or with not even, or possibly even like a disembodied character, like for instance, a voice-based spoken dialogue system. All right, so I want to focus this really on this challenge. So how can we produce multimodal communicative behavior, right? And actually now when we look back, we have almost been working on this as a field, let's say at least 2 decades now, right? So in 2005, a bunch of people, like for instance here, including, you might know some of them, Stacy Marcella, Norm Badler, Louise Johnson, Chris Thorson, Catherine Pellachot, and also this young guy here. They met in Reykjavik in Iceland, and then they came up with this idea. Okay, let's maybe like agree upon a common architecture for multimodal behavior generation. And I guess you all know you all know this interface languages like BML and FML and so on and so forth that came out of this this initiative. And nowadays we have a lot of work that has been done in order to be able to produce gesture multimodal behavior as specified, for instance, in a markup language, namely the behavior markup language BML, right? For robots as well as for virtual characters. And you can also have like different realizers that produce one and the same BML on different embodiments nowadays, right? All right, but this is only behavior realization. So the last step basically here in this production pipeline, right? So this is if the system decided how to behave, so what kind of behavior to produce. So then just realizing it through overt speech, overt movements, and so on and so forth, animations. But the previous stages that also needs to be addressed are way harder, right? Behavior planning, like given a communicative idea, what kind of behavior should I be performing? And then afterwards, only then I have to perform them, right? And even before that, what is the communicative idea that I need to get across now in order to, get the interaction going, for instance? All right. So let's focus on the example of producing speech and gesture together, right? So I'm doing speech here on the fly in a dialogue situation, even more so. Spoken language interaction, and we're talking about embodied AI here, right? So I also have like nonverbal modalities here, like for instance gestures, right? So I produce a lot of gestures on the fly together with my speech. We have like 50-60 years of gesture research nowadays, and it's a big field nowadays. And people have looked a lot at how humans gesture and how they gesture when they learn a second language, how they gesture in development. So when children acquire language, how gesture breaks down when you have, like, for instance, aphasia and all these things, right? And still, it's really an open question, what is really the underlying like mechanisms and how speech and gesture are combined, right? And just as well in our field, so when we talk about multimodal embodied agents, for instance, we also want them to be able to produce embodied communication, so to produce gesture and speech together, not only for the sake of being nice to watch or something, or lively or entertaining, but also for the sake of being communicatively efficient, right? So in order to, the assumption is that it really helps the communication in a specific situation. So the classical approach that is like similar to the BML pipeline that I just showed you before is what I would call intent-driven generation. So we assume that, for instance, through a dialogue system, we would have an idea of what the agent is supposed to be conveying, right? So some speaker meaning, plus some additional information about, there's an affective state, there is maybe some social conversational functions, like for instance, I want to also be polite, I want to keep the turn afterwards, all these kind of things, right? So what this is like a given. And then the question is, how can we come up with a model that produces words, and another model, most often, that produces gesture, and how to integrate these two guys, right? So that is like speech gesture generation driven by communicative intent. Now, the second approach that we also saw quite early, and nowadays almost all over the place, is not quite speech and gesture generation, but it's gesture generation driven by speech that we assume to be already there. So we assume and we take a given linguistic input, either as audio or as text, plus some additional information maybe about what kind of style the speaker has or what speaker it is, so idea of a speaker and so on and so forth. And then we have the words or the acoustics, and the question is, how can we have a model that maps those onto gestures so that selects and performs gestures to go along with it in a certain way. Many approaches do it like directly. Others do it by also trying to interpret the words, basically to derive like an intent to some extent, and then to use that information and to also inform the gesture generation here. And if we look back, and also now, if we look also now today, we see we have been, so we used to have a lot of approaches here in that realm. Nowadays, almost everybody is working on this problem more. Why is that? Well, because we have a lot of data available, and people try to do sort of like an end-to-end learning here through machine learning means, right? All right. Okay, but let's have a closer look. So originally, one of the like seminal systems was the VII system, right? So 2001, and the idea is, okay, we have text input, so it's speech driven, but then there's a bunch of rules being applied in order to interpret the language. Then there's rules, so to come up, for instance, with a parse tree, then there's rules to suggest behaviors, and then there's rules to filter those suggested behaviors. And then afterwards, the remaining behaviors are scheduled and then executed basically and synthesized, right? So a lot of rules, and that idea basically also is not dead or so, right? So also the people later on, like almost 10 years later, still have used that idea here. So to process the text first, and then there's a lot of rules and analysis steps that it works on the text in order to augment it. And then there's the behavior mapping that basically then suggests a lot of behaviors that then get scheduled and animated finally. So that's rule-based. We also have been working on other approaches, namely approaches that are more, let's say, more systematic and more flexible and generative. So let's say an immediate approach would be to define a lexicon. So to come up with a library of canned gestures or animations, and then to have rules to pick from those, right? And then to combine them, right? That is what people have been doing like a lot in the past. We have been trying to come up with not to use like a finite set of gestures, let's say gesture repertoire, but really to come up with a planning approach, a generative model that is able to give them a certain communicative intention in terms of this is the meaning that I want to express, that plans speech and gesture together. And that means the speech is being planned using natural language generation techniques. So really like to build, like a syntactic structure according to lexicon and grammar and so on and so forth. And at the same time to build a new gesture out of certain features and then to combine them in a reasonable way. And how they can be combined is then, in that approach, also needs to be defined in terms of certain operators. So for instance, through a multimodal grammar or so, right? So taking that approach actually really means that you have very strong theoretical assumptions about the compositionality of speech and of gesture in itself, but also about the compositionality of how the both can be combined together. But nevertheless, just to give you an example, and because I think it's fun to see those old systems, so we talk about 2004. Here's an example of what we were able to produce with this.
Okay.
So just as as background information, so this is it's called NUMEC system that we developed in the States in Northwestern University, and the idea is, so the task of the agent is to give directions about the campers.
Okay.
Next, go straight and turn right before the Technological Institute.
Okay.
Then go straight and pass the Technological Institute on your left and continue straight. After that, turn left after the Technological Institute and keep going straight.
Uh-huh.
Then turn right after the Nano Fabrication Center, which is the big building to your right.
All right, so you see, of course, animations doesn't look as natural, and graphics and rendering doesn't look as natural as what we can do nowadays. The voice doesn't sound as natural as what we can do nowadays, right? But nevertheless, so every verbal utterance as well as every gesture was really totally created on the spot, and the system had a semantic representation of the meaning that it has put into the words and into the gesture. So then to embed this in a dialogue setting, for instance, would allow us then to also like come up with grounding based on the multimodal behavior, right? So that was kind of like very interesting theoretically, and it also allowed us to produce a bunch of very interesting gestures. But nevertheless, people didn't stop there, and we didn't either. And then people really started to build larger and larger corpora, and then trying to use that data in order to learn models that could produce gestures, right? We did so in an intent-driven approach, where we combine certain assumptions about what might be important features about the gesture, and we combine it with data and learned a probabilistic model out of this data, right? So a structured probabilistic model, in this case the Bayesian decision network, that generates iconic gestures, and not just, again, not just selects a gesture, but really builds the gesture together, generates it out of different features that it assembles basically, right? So in order to convey that let's say that spatial geometrical information, I should be doing this hand shape together with this trajectory in this direction, for instance. So this is sort of like the planning problem. The model were built from and learned from a large corpus, Saga corpus, which is also available online and publicly available. About 6,000 gestures. They're all like finely annotated in terms of form features, but also meaning and discourse context and so on and so forth. But of course, nowadays we have other kinds of learning methods, namely deep learning, right? And people have been applying deep learning to almost everything, including gesture generation. Now, video data is out there, and what people have been doing is, so they take, for instance, usually TED Talks here from YouTube, and then they create a model that is able to able to predict gestures based from the speech signal, basically, right? So deep neural networks are being trained in an unsupervised manner on large data sets, and then the generative parts is used for synthesis, right? And either as a recurrent network or in an autoregressive way, or they even or they encode and decode whole motion sequences at once, basically. So here, just to show you what is able, what is possible with these models. So here's a very state-of-the-art example, and this is also nice because it compares this approach together with other state-of-the-art methods, right? All right.
And health of both for senior citizens as well as for patients who stay in the hospitals. So, like I said, this.
Okay, so there's a lot of things to consider here, right? So first of all, that looks quite natural, right? So there's a lot of like activity, and the movements are being like reproduced, and the movements are also temporally consistent with the intonation, with the acoustic cues often, right? But it's not really easy to train models to actually reproduce all these kinds of different movements, right? So there's a lot of problem with collapsing models, so that they have regression to the mean, and they just only produce like a mean pose and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, you can, like using regularization and other techniques, you can cope with that problem, such that you can, and this is like the state of the art nowadays. People are able to produce those behaviors, so those gestures. But those gestures are not really representational, right? So there's no like semantic meaning in the gesture. So all that these methods are able to produce is basically like what's called beat gestures. So these like dynamic body movements, basically very generic body movements, almost meaningless, but finely synchronized with the the peak intensities in speech, for instance, right? If you evaluate it also with subjective measures and human raters, you see there's a big problem in terms of what is appropriate, in terms of, like, for instance, how the gesture fits the speech, and also how natural it is being perceived. And also the temporal consistency with is usually quite good, but the semantic consistency is quite low. Also, there's almost no there's very limited online capabilities of those models, because they usually operate on, let's say, 2 to 4 seconds of behavior right at once. Okay, so by and large, now to give you like an overview, what I feel like the field has been, so how the field has been developing throughout the last basically 2 decades is, it looks like this. So on the one hand side, we see that the models have becoming more and more natural, right? So the behavior that they can produce have become more and more natural. But the other like axis might be even more important, right? Namely, to be able to produce behavior that really is, communicatively efficient, right? So there's some sort of communicative efficacy, whether it's there or not. And if we see the intent-driven approaches that people have been working on first, when we have been using lexicons and rules and planning and stuff, we were able to produce gestures that on the spot communicate what is needed in order to be what needs to be communicated right now, but they don't really look very natural or convincing. And on the other hand, the speech-driven and database models nowadays, through retrieval and especially through learning, there we have like a lot of like naturalness, if you will, and lifelikeness and so on and so forth, but almost no communicative efficacy, right? Although people claim, the models are able to produce like an iconic or a dactic gesture, but that is almost, that's really, let's say, impoverished if at all. Yeah. All right, so question now is, of course, how can we come up here, right? So how can we produce behavior that is really like acceptable, natural, convincing, and also, I mean, communicatively efficient and effective? And this is where I come back to my my original title of the talk. So what do we actually need to take into account to have systems that are socially aware? And in our example here, in our focus on speech and gesture generation, what needs to be taken into account? What has the system to be socially aware of in order to be able to produce gestures that really could fulfill both of these criteria, if you will? Okay, so if we look at this problem, so we can, by and large, distinguish between different, features or aspects that are seemingly important in order to and influential in the way we behave and we communicate in a social interaction, right? Of course, there's persistent features like cultural background, personality, style, and so on and so forth. People have been working on that quite a lot, and those things can be annotated and also, learned by models. When then there is, situative features that are more or less like stable throughout a specific, a current limited period of time or situational context, like in a certain environment, on a certain task, and maybe mood of a user or a speaker, but nevertheless then change from one situation to the other. This is also something that people are trying to take into account, obviously, right? But there's also, I think, and this is why I put this dynamic in the title of the talk, there's a lot of like dynamic processes and features and aspects that are influencing how we behave and how a system should behave, basically, in order to communicate with us in an acceptable, natural, intuitive way. Right? And the first is that the way we gesture and speak together is obviously the result of very complex cognitive processes. And even if we, as a speaker, don't necessarily always plan to produce certain gestures and speech together intentionally, we do so because of the kind of problem that underlies our thinking. And often this means that is also, telling and informative of, for instance, what's happening in the speaker's mind, even if it's not, intentionally communicated. So there's cognitive processes, and in psycholinguistics, we often speak of thinking for speaking as a specific, mode of thinking that needs to be done by the brain or mind when it is producing language, for instance, and that also has an influence on gesture, right? And we have a lot of findings in speech and gesture and gesture research specifically that are being analyzed and where people try to come up with explanations in this way, right? So simple question, for instance. So how is information organized and distributed across verbal and gesture behavior, right? You see sometimes people doing like
Die rechte Kirche hat in der Mitte so ein rundes Fenster.
So a round window. So
Okay.
yes, the roundness is in the speech, the roundness is in the gesture. This is what's sometimes called redundant gesture.
Also die rechte Kirche hat auf Boden, also erstmal so ein Tor.
So such a gate, right? So the shape of the gate is only the gesture. The language, nevertheless, now points didactically, so it refers to the gesture, such a gate, right? This is what's called complementary.
Vielleicht auch die Hälfte. Ich glaube, da war eine Uhr drauf.
So I think there was a clock, but the shape of the clock is only in the gesture, right? It's not at all in the speech, for instance, right? So how would that come about? None of these, well, at least not here, Maha, which at that time was a PhD student of mine, deliberately, I guess, planned to not produce the shape information verbally, right? To utter it verbally. All right. So now, as I was saying, there's a lot of theories in psycholinguistics, and at the same time, we also have quite a lot of work in, for instance, cognitive modeling in the field of cognitive science and cognitive architectures that provide us with computational accounts of, for instance, how memory processes and reasoning processes can be modeled, for instance, right? And what you can do now is you can take psycholinguistic theories and try to implement them based on these cognitive architectures, right? And we did that, and with such a model, and I don't have time to go into the details here, but I'm more than happy to explain or to tell you about it more, maybe offline or so, or during the Q&A session. But we came up with a cognitive model of speech and gesture generation here, and then when we run it, and what you see here basically is like let's say you have all the different kinds of components that are there here. So up here, just to give you like the basic overall idea, the idea is that we have a working memory that has on the one hand side, let's say a mental image. So it has like imagistic components, and on the other hand, it has like propositional symbolic content, basically, right? So here you would have the mental image of a let's say of a tree or something, and here you would have a certain concept, a propositional representation of the concept of being, let's say, tall or so, right? And the idea is now these things come to be linked through what we call multimodal concepts. So you have like, of course, you know what tallness is. You know, you have a concept of tall, and you have a linguistic term for tall. At the same time, you have a mental image of what it means to be tall, and you can now match the one onto the other. And this is basically the idea that we model that process. And the idea is that what is active after a certain period of time, having this process run, what is active here in this in the visual memory would basically inform gesture production, and what is active in the, let's say, in the propositional verbal symbolic memory would then inform speech production, and that basically is the idea here. Now, what's nice about this, for instance, then you could like play around with it. And entertain a lot of different hypotheses. For instance, okay, how would the time that I give this model to think, how would that influence the resulting behavior, right? And what we found is, for instance, that if we give it more time to think, then so here n2, n3, and 4 is like the number of cycles that we gave it, basically, especially this memory processes before we had the production systems, you know, retrieve information from the memories. The more time we gave it to think, basically to establish this multimodal, you know, message, as we call it, the semantically richer the speech gets, and in result, the more redundant the gesture is, for instance, right? You also could, for instance, obviously artificially, let's say, impair the language system by saying, I'm limiting the grammar, because, so for instance, here in this case, we changed the grammar so that it wouldn't be able to put an adjective in a noun phrase or so, right? So if the system then if the model is lacking that, you know, verbal expressivity, then it starts to produce different strategies, for instance, by starting to produce two consecutive phrases. Right, and one phrase only then, you know, produces or conveys information about the existence of a certain object, in this case the window, and where it is, but how it looks like, which couldn't be encoded here in the first phrase. Then, you know, it gets conveyed by a second phrase together with this respective gesture, for instance. So that's nice. Second, very important thing to take into account when trying to make sense of, like, let's say, how speech and gesture come about. And this is all, you know, what we learn through decades, basically, of research and looking into humans and looking at what we can do with systems and how the behavior looks that the systems are able to produce, for instance, right? Very important often is, okay, so iconic gestures are kind of like nice, right? Because we can think of, okay, there is sort of like some meaning of the gesture, and we can think of, okay, what is the meaning like? And this is presumably part of the communicative intention of the speaker, and the speaker then, you know, comes up with a gesture as a solution to the problem of communicating a specific, you know, meaning, basically speaker meaning, right? But there is a lot of other things in gestures, for instance, right? So many gestures that we see and that we make don't have this clear, don't have this clear representational functions, basically. But there's other functions. So here are 3 examples of gestures that I guess we all of us will recognize as they are being like totally common, and we see it like almost every day, and people do it all the time. But what actually do they, you know, express or convey?
Was mich wirklich interessiert hat.
So what really interests me.
Aus Erfahrung kann ich sagen,
So out of experience, I can say.
Diese ganze, also
So all of this stuff. So very short movements, very short gestures. Some of them are more like a symbolic nature. So he's like pointing upwards, but it's not a didactic gesture. It's more like a symbolic pointing upwards. She's doing more like a very short shrug. He's doing this like swiping away gestures. What are the functions of these gestures, right? We don't have a very good. We don't really have a very. We don't have actually a very a computational model of this, right? In the literature, there's a few approaches. For instance, Kenton called it modal functions, and he already said gesture already help a lot by, for instance, commenting upon, the verbal message, for instance, right? So to make it clear that something is locally applied negative, or that this is meant as an hypothesis or assertion, and so on and so forth, or they are like intensifying or for an evaluative statement and those things, right? But for a computational, model, and for using it with agents, what we need to have is, of course, like a mapping from what is the communicative intent of the speaker, for instance, also to mark that something is not so certain or that something needs to be put in focus and really needs to be tended to by the addressee, and what are these functions, and how would these functions can be mapped onto gestures, for instance, right? So what we did is we started by acquiring a lot of data, just as examples that you just saw. Then we had humans rate the speakers based on the gestures and the speech, and rating them in terms of adjectives. So how positive, how certain, how opinionated, and so on and so forth do you think the speaker was? Then we do some, data analysis, clustering, and so on and so forth. And then we extract certain rules and models, and then we apply them with an artificial agent. And then we can produce behavior in a very systematic and controlled fashion. And then we can evaluate it with human users and see what they actually, how they interpret it, right? So, and if you do that, for instance, for iconic gestures, you see, interestingly, it's really that you. Iconic gestures not only convey meaning, right? They're not only representational. That's one of the main functions of them, but also they are meta-communicative in the sense that they signal prominence. So the mere fact that you produce a gesture signals prominence, basically, right? That is work that we did together with Alan Chenke from Amsterdam. We also did it with the gestures that I just showed you before, and also then when we do the clustering on the ratings of the human observers, different clusters emerge. So you have this very strong cluster where people feel like, okay, here the speaker is really putting something in focus, so emphasizing something, right? And the gestures that usually go along with this is, for instance, this upward pointing. Pay attention to, obviously. There's also the opposite cluster, if you will, namely negative focusing, so de-emphasizing something. So I'm telling you something, but it's probably not really important or so. And another cluster is what we call epistemic minus, a negative epistemic here. So people are really speakers mark also through their nonverbal behavior, and in this case the gesture, that they are uncertain about something, right? They tell it nevertheless. Maybe it's the best that they can do in this specific point in time, but they mark it so that the speaker, that the addressee can actually also then, get this additional meta-communicative information and take it into account. Right. So Farina Freigang, one of my PhD students, what she did was she then remodeled that behavior with our virtual agent Billy, and had it tell human participants in the study certain information. And either it would be doing focusing gestures all the time, or epistemic minus gestures all the time on the very same text, right? And afterwards, she was asking them, okay, what do you remember of it? And what you find, for instance, here is that when the agent is doing a lot of, uncertain behavior, let's say epistemic minus or so, people also tend to not remember that much of that information. Whereas when it's put into focus, then people also pay attention to it more strongly, and then they also remember it more strongly. By the way, here she's not only using gestures, she has been combining it together with speech rate, loudness, so prosodic cues, also facial cues like eyebrows, mouth, and so on and so forth. It really was like a multimodal, let's say, expression of certain pragmatic functions. Okay, so finally, and which makes things even more complicated, is, okay, in a normal situation, in an interaction and conversation, you're not doing a monologue, obviously, right? So you are producing behavior in response to not only what you would like to get across, but also towards a certain advocacy in a certain situation, right? And there's a lot of, you know, interpersonal adaptation and coordination processes that take place, obviously, right? So just to give you a few examples that we also saw in a lot of different studies. So one is we see there's alignment. So this automatic, let's say, phenomenon that behavior becomes more or less similar, right? Within a certain speaker, but also across speakers. So there's inter-agent gestural alignment, right? And we saw it in human-human dialogue. So people tend to, you know, to align the way they use their gestures, for instance. And there's been in literature different, you know, hypotheses as to what this might be due to. For instance, grounding processes, but also motor resonance, so automatic, like sensory motor resonances through mirror neurons and those things, for instance. So there's we also have we have proposed a model for that that basically has two routes of alignments, one automatic sensory motor route and one more deliberative or route through grounding processes or something. What we also found is that humans align to agents. So if an agent, for instance, changes the way of gesturing, in this case here from one-handed to two-handed, in like a reciprocal interaction, then the humans also would be inclined to also change their way in that same direction, right? Yeah. So the way you produce gesture and speech together in a certain situation is not the function only of your communicative meaning and your personality and your style and all this kind of stuff, but it's also a function of the bigger, you know, social situation and the discourse that you have just had with the specific other interaction partner and the behavior that your interaction partner, your interlocutor, produced in this very dialogue before, right? Even
A lot like a tube.
Sorry, so this is an even more impressive example of people co-narrating something. So they narrating something together, and you see this motor resonance and entrainment very, very intriguingly here.
A lot like a tube with a storm drain that's like spiral shape.
So it's almost as if one person takes over the gesture of the first one and also takes over the verbal utterances and then, continues. And then we have, for instance, other phenomena like reduction. So you start out with a gesture in order to describe, for instance, here in this example, the participant is a direction giving scenario. So he is giving a direction to this guy, and here he's starting out like doing a gesture, a very elaborated and kinematically complex gesture for a church with two towers, right? And then after like a few seconds, he comes back to it, and then he's doing this gesture. So it's a reduced gesture, kinematically reduced gesture, right? But then the other person also picks up on that, and when he repeats it, and then he talks about the tower, then he's doing an even more reduced gesture, and so on and so forth. And then they go back and forth, basically on the fly, negotiating, establishing, gestures, for instance. So how would a machine learning approach be able to predict that kind of gesture for this specific, referent, right? Without being aware of the fact that there is like this preceding interaction context, basically, that has shaped this gesture in this particular situation, for instance. And this is why I think we have to we have to work towards what I would call interaction-centered models. So we have to have an idea of that there is a cognitive process within each of the two participants, and these cognitive processes, or embodied cognitive and affective processes for that matter, but they come to be coupled through a behavior interaction dynamic. So we have these different processes, and those give rise to the behavior that we see, actually, right? And this obviously is fundamentally different than just learning a model, which is more or less like an average model out of like thousands of hours of different speakers in different situations, for instance. So if we take this seriously, then we would need to have computational models that, instead of processing and synthesizing isolated signals, that start to try to establish continuous interaction loops in an ongoing interaction. Instead of trying to process self-contained form meaning pairs, really try to come up with ways to produce incrementally co-constructed behavior. instead of processing, let's say, global interaction states, which is, for instance, what dialogue systems nowadays do, right? So we have things like dialogue state tracking challenges there, and the question is, okay, what is the state of the dialogue? And the dialogue as such, right? But as opposed to that, what we would need to do, I think, is we would need to have models that are able to discern between the internal subjective states and the reciprocal perspectives towards each other. So what I know, what I think, what he knows, and so on and so forth. And also, I think we don't need to work towards optimality-driven decision-making algorithms. So it doesn't need to be like the planning algorithm that comes up with a gesture, which is supposedly the optimal solution for, you know, this production problem in the specific situation. It's better to be fast and to come up with a good enough solution, but then to be able to, you know, to engage in this co-construction interaction loop, and then to be able to see how the other basically picks up on it and responds to it, and then to engage in subsequent adaptive coordination, basically. All right, so time is almost up. I would have shown you a bunch of like technical projects that we have been doing and that we are doing actually in order to move towards this direction, right? So one is to have like a consequently incremental architecture in multimodal agents, for instance, right? So where we have incremental speech recognition at the same time, incremental nonverbal behavior recognition at the same time, already also planning responses and producing them, for instance, right? And that would afford us with like very novel ways in order to enable dialogue that are really fluent and where you could have barge-ins and interruptions and those things, for instance. So just to show an example, I think it's unfortunately in German, but you see how fluent the interaction is.
Hörst du mich?
Sorry, this was sorry.
Hallo, hast du kurz Zeit?
Ja, Billy, ich habe Zeit.
Dann gehen wir jetzt den Rest dieser Woche durch.
Mhm.
Gut. Mittwoch um 9 Uhr ist Frühstück.
Mhm.
Um 16:30 Uhr hast du Geld holen.
Warte mal, Billy. Ich habe noch einen Termin.
Gut, also ein neuer Eintrag.
Ja, ich möchte am Mittwoch gerne schwimmen gehen.
Um wie viel Uhr fängt das an?
Das geht von 12 bis 13 Uhr.
Gut, dann trage ich also Folgendes
Oder nein,
ein.
bis 1:30.
Also bis 13:30 Uhr.
Genau.
Okay.
Okay, so this is just an example of how fluent interaction becomes possible, but of course only in a very narrow scenario, because here it's really about, I mean, they talk about, you know, managing a calendar entries basically, but through incremental processing, and to have it adaptive in the sense that, okay, sometimes I can rely on cues and early cues and can respond to those. For instance, even the fact that the user starts to start speaking is enough for the agent, of course, to look for options to yield the turn, basically to interrupt itself, and then, but while doing so, and maybe also while signaling this non-verbally, keep processing the input of the user in order to also replan then the subsequent dialogue, for instance, and those things. All right. Yes, I think I'll leave it like this. We also have been working on coupling these two things, namely multimodal communication dynamics and, let's say, social cognitive dynamics, or the cognitive processes that are underlying those. So because you have to have the models, as I was already trying to convince you, that are able to process, you know, incrementally arriving data, partial data, and information in terms of some hypothesis about underlying mental states and interaction states, and then to plan your behavior and response based on that, for instance, right? And here, Henrik Buschmeier, a PhD student in my lab, then postdocs now he's already a professor of digital linguistics at Bielefeld University. He has been working on coordinating dialogue through feedback signals and what feedback signals actually could mean. And feedback signal is something that you get while you are producing yourself behavior, right? So when you're producing behavior and you get feedback signals, then you are really confronted with a problem. You're producing behavior at the same time you have to process input. And then when you process input, so how would that actually then change your running behavior, right? And he was able to do that, and already also showed in an evaluation study that actually works quite well and is positively evaluated. All right, so to wrap up, there's a lot of trends in AI to make systems, what I'm calling here, X-aware. So you have context aware, you have human aware, you have socially aware, you have interaction aware, and so on and so forth. You have knowledge aware and those things, right? But they generally strive for the same thing, namely capturing the features that have really affected human interaction, right? A lot of hard questions, obviously, and there's obviously no general answers to those. So you have to answer them specifically for any given system in any given context, right? So what are those aspects that need to really be taken account of, right? So how to recognize, represent those features, how to respond to them, right? But what I would call socially aware interactive agents, those really need to be able to account for features that are like for one thing, observational. So things that can be observed, recognized, and they also, to some extent, the agent could rely on that the interlocutor produces them in an ostensive way. So in order for the agent to be able to recognize them, but there's also a lot of like hidden, latent features that need to be inferred, right? And then there's features that are persistent or situated or contextual, but then there's all these highly dynamic features, and that really means that I think we need to move from state-based models that are preformed, that also includes, I think, predefined or pre-trained, towards interaction-centered models, right? Then combine this dynamic social cognition with incremental reciprocal multimodal communication. Okay, I think that's enough for now, and I thank you for your attention and look forward to questions.